evening, everyone. I'll just conclude within another 15 to 20 minutes maximum. I'll just try to conclude what we were discussing in the last class. We were discussing about, we had completed end of ideology and we had started with end of history, and we had, by and large, we had covered the end of history also. All right. What we need to understand, and I was talking to you about the Francis Fukuyama's thesis about end of history. So the base, so far as end of ideology or the end of history is concerned, the base of both the theories, base of the thesis of both theories, they remain the same. Okay. But there are some differences also. We will also see the difference between end of ideology theory and end of ideology theory and end of history theory. We'll see the difference between the two, because you can be asked a question. Right. So the main crux of the thesis of Francis Fukuyama is that there has been an end of Cold War, and there is no challenger, there is no contender to the Western liberal democracy. Means history has resulted into, the Cold War has resulted into the victory of liberal democracy. All right. So liberal democracy has become victorious. All right. And this, according to Fukuyama, automatically proves that liberalism has been the end of history. Because why he's saying liberalism is the end of history? Because history has always been understood by Fukuyama as a conflict between two different ideologies. All right. So since the conflict between two ideologies, one the capitalism and the Marxism or the communism, that has come to an end with the end of Cold War. And not only with the end of Cold War, but also because of the breakup of the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was not in a position to challenge the supremacy of United States of America. All right. So what Fukuyama is saying, that end of Cold War did not only symbolize the end of ideological conflict between the Western capitalism and Eastern communism, but at the same time, it also symbolized the end of history. Means ideological evolution has come to an end. Now there will be no other ideology. So if ideology is not, no other ideology has to be, will be there, and it has resulted into the supremacy of liberalism or liberal capitalism. This means history has come to an end, because history always understood in terms of a conflict of two conflicting ideologies. Right. So according to Fukuyama, there is a global consensus that there is no better way to live life other than the liberal democratic way. What Fukuyama said, there is only one way to lead a better life, and that is by following the liberal capitalist democratic model. All right. So that is why he's saying history has come to an end. All right. Now, Fukuyama says that it is not only the question of end of Cold War, which has resulted into the end of history, but it is also the collapse of the USSR. It is also the collapse of Soviet Union. Right. And Western model of democracy has become a universal model for the world. And wherever communism, the people tried to create communism or establish communism, right? All those countries have failed, all right? And all of them have re-adopted the liberal democratic model, all right? With the exception of the Arab world, because Arab world has been proved to be an exception. All right, Arab exceptionalism we have already discussed. Because why? Because what the theories say is that the monarchy, the kind of situation that is there in Arab world, where the countries had some of the countries had undergone Arab Spring. But the point is, the US's policies in the Middle East has been such that US has always been supporting, and US is still supporting the monarchy and the dictatorship in the Arab world. All right. And for that point of, US has never tried to export democracy or to export liberal democratic model in the Arab world. All right. So despite the Arab Spring being there in Egypt, Tunisia, and some other countries, USA ensured that Arab Spring turns into Arab summer. That is what they have said. Because US worked wholeheartedly to ensure that Arab Spring doesn't become successful. All right. So according to Western scholars, democracy can come anywhere in the world, but not in the Islamic world, because there is a contradiction between Islam as a religion and democracy. All right. So there is a contradiction between the two. According to Western scholars, so if the Arab world has not adopted the liberal democratic model or the liberal capitalist economic model, all right, this means that they are the exception. So except for the Arab world, everywhere, liberal capitalism has become the order of the day. All right. Now, so that is what Fukuyama says. Now, what we need to understand, later on, Fukuyama made some change, and he modified his own ideas about the end of history thesis. What he had said earlier is that end of history by Fukuyama, end of history theory as given by Fukuyama, has led to, and it was interpreted as, the establishment of US hegemony in the world. Try to understand the point. It led to establishment of US hegemony in the world. End of Cold War, and the fall of Soviet Union has resulted into the US supremacy in the world, and has made the world unipolar. All right. This is what was accepted by Fukuyama also. So, looking history from that perspective, he said that since the capitalist economic model led by the US has become the order of the day, so history has come to an end. But later on, Fukuyama was forced to bring about some modification in his theory, bring about some modification in his thesis, and it said that because of US failure in Afghanistan, because of US withdrawal, failure of US in Afghanistan, failure of US in Iraq, all right, and failure of US intervention in Syria, and withdrawal of US from the Syria, and also gradual withdrawal of the US even from the South China Sea. All right. So gradual withdrawal of the US, all right, from the South China Sea, from Afghanistan, we have seen recently, from Syria, from Vietnam. So basically, what Fukuyama says is that it is because of all these events have placed a question mark on the US hegemony, which Francis Fukuyama had tried to prove. Francis Fukuyama, after the fall of Soviet Union, had tried to establish that US hegemony as world capitalism led by US has become the order of the world, has become a global order, with the exception of Arab countries. But he was forced to change his thesis because of withdrawal of the US, because of the US policy of withdrawal from the world, particularly during Donald Trump, we have seen. But for all this, Fukuyama has blamed the former US President George Bush. He holds George Bush responsible for that. The president before Barack Obama, George Bush was the US president. You are already aware of that. So Fukuyama said that it was a wrong on the part of George Bush to start the two wars simultaneously. One war in Iraq, all right, and another war that US fought in Afghanistan. So the Fukuyama said, what has led to the fall of US also, fall of US power, and what has led to the fall of the US hegemony in the world were the two wrong decisions. The wrong decision taken by the George Bush to fight two wars simultaneously, one in Afghanistan 2001 and another in Iraq 2003. So these two wars which US fought under George Bush were the responsible for the end of the US hegemony. All right. So why he was forced to revise this is because he wanted to. He never accepted. He never accepted that there has that it reflects the failure of the world capitalist economic model. But he only said that it has brought about the end of U.S. hegemony because of the wrong policies of United States of America under the presidency of George Bush. Right. And he said he went to the extent of saying, had George Bush not started these two wars simultaneously, one the Iraq war and another the Afghanistan war, it would have never resulted into the decline of the US regime. All right. So because why he was forced to change his thesis, revise thesis, because end of US hegemony put a question mark on the capitalist model itself. All right. So, but he on the only modification made by Fukuyama was that the wrong policy decision taken by George Bush to start two wars simultaneously that has resulted into the fall of the US hegemony. Otherwise, US hegemony would have remained there. All right. Let us try to understand what is the major criticism of the end of history theory. All right. End of history theory was criticized by Samuel P. Huntington. Earlier, I have referred to Huntington also when we are discussing about the waves of democracy. If we were talking about Huntington also. So Huntington, Samuel P. Huntington, he gave a reason for why he did not appreciate, why he challenged the theory of end of history. So let us look into what is the take of Samuel P. Huntington regarding the end of history thesis. All right. Now, according to Huntington, history can never come to an end. All right. So long as the world is there, so long as the world is there, so long as the universe is there, history can never come to an end. All right, because end of history thesis is not the correct description of the post-Cold War situation. See, what is the evidence of end of history according to Fukuyama? The evidence is end of Cold War and establishment of US hegemony. That is the evidence. But Huntington says that end of history thesis is incorrect, and that is not a correct description of the post-Cold War situation as explained by Fukuyama. All right, he said history never comes to an end and history repeats itself. We have seen the saying goes that history can never come to an end because history repeats itself. All right. Why history repeats itself and why history can never come to an end? It says that the post-Cold War scenario, or the order that has replaced the world, the order that has come after the end of Cold War. See what Fukuyama said, end of Cold War means end of history. All right. Why? Because capitalist hegemony led by US has been established. Huntington says that history can never come to an end, and brother, history is going to repeat itself. What he says is that the post-Cold War order that has emerged in the world, that is a reflection of, right, to understand the point, post-Cold War order that has emerged in the world, that is the reflection of the Cold War. All right, that is a reflection of the pre-Cold War order. All right, so post-Cold War situation is a consequence of the pre-Cold War situation. All right, so how can you say that history has come to an end? Because past gets its reflection in the present. So post-Cold War order is a reflection of, and so long as the current order survives and order remains, so you cannot forget the history. All right. So history is going to repeat itself. According to Huntington, history is going to repeat itself because why is it going to repeat itself? Because that is the nature of history, that it will repeat itself. Right. Yesterday, I gave you an example. That there are different stages of growth development. You start with agriculture, followed by industrialization, followed by technological advancement, followed by technological sophistication. That is the last stage of development. All right. But the advancement of technology has taken in such a manner, the technology has become so much sophisticated that any kind of misadventure by any power could lead to end of civilization, could lead to, and we'll have to go back to the stage of agriculture once again. All right. So history can never come to an end. All right. So that is the criticism of end of history theory given by Samuel P. Huntington. Let us now briefly compare end of ideology, end of history. How do we compare? See, what is the basis of end of ideology theory? The basis of end of ideology theory is economic. This is what you need to understand. What end of ideology theory says that right now, politics has taken a backseat. Ideological conflict has taken a backseat. And what has become imperative now is the development, is a socio-economic development. So everywhere, whether we talk about the developed world or whether we talk about the developing societies, everywhere people talk about the socio-economic development. So parity is on development. So socio-economic development has become the parity. All right. And improving the life conditions of the masses, that has become the priority through socio-economic development. All right. Why? Because according to end of ideology thesis, the ideological war has come to an end between capitalism and communism, and intensity of class conflict has been softened. Now, intensity of class conflict, which used to be there, is no longer there. Why? Because welfare state policies have been adopted by all the capitalist countries and even the developing societies. So intensity of class conflict has gone away. It's not there. All right. Means the goal of socio-economic development, or the emphasis on socio-economic development, has made ideological conflict redundant. The idea of ideological conflict has been made redundant because of a new emphasis on socio-economic development and welfare policies of the government. Right. This means that by and large, focus of end of ideology theory was economic. All right. Now, let us try to understand what is the end of history. What is the end of history and how do we compare? And finally, we'll see the similarity between them. Let us try to understand. End of history is basically a post-Cold War event. All right. And it says that conflict between East and West has come to an end. And acceptance of liberal capitalism across the globe as the only successful model. What is my point? Conflict between East and West has come to an end. When you talk about the conflict between East and West, this argument here is political. In case of end of ideology, the argument was economic. Emphasis was on development. But in end of history, the emphasis is on a discussion about the post-Cold War situation, which reflects that end of conflict between East and West, right? And acceptance of liberal capitalism across the globe. Right? Means Western liberal democracy has on the ideological back. Try to understand the point. End of history says the victory of Western liberal democracy or acceptance of Western liberal democracy model across the globe has resulted into the ideological victory. Ideological war has led into the victory of liberal democracy in the world. So the emphasis is on ideological conflict and emphasis is on ideology. So the logic of end of history is political, but the logic behind end of history, ultimately base is the same. But when you look into the difference between the two, what we find that the end of history logic is political. It is ideological. But there we're talking end of history, end of ideology. We're talking about end of history. We're talking end of ideology. We were talking about the economic aspect. We're talking giving emphasis on development. So Western liberal democracy has on the ideological model. That is what says the end of history. Right. Now, means progress of history has reached its ultimate destination. Means progress of history has reached its saturation point. According to end of history theory, progress of history has reached its ultimate destination. After that, there is nothing. Because that is why history has come to an end. So the argument in case of end of history is political and ideological. An argument in case of end of ideology is economic, and emphasis is on development. All right. Now, let's try to understand what is the similarity between the two. There is a large scale similarity between the two because both end of history and end of ideology thesis both believed in victory of Western capitalism. That is the similarity. So that is why I said earlier, base is the same. So what is the similarity? That both believe in the victory of Western capitalism. All right. Secondly, both end of ideology thesis and end of history thesis, they claim that liberal democracy is the best political system across the globe. Best political system is the liberal democratic system. Both end of ideology, end of history, they agree on that. Right? Third similarity you will find that while talking about the end of ideology and while talking about the end of history, the focus was on the study of Western countries only. By looking into the situation in Western countries, in Europe and United States of America, the thesis saw the light of the day. So what was the basis of the thesis? Basis of the thesis for both end of ideology and end of history was that this is based on the study of Western model. So both the theses are Western-centric thesis or West-centric thesis. Right. So they look into the happenings in Western Europe and United States of America and completely ignored the development that was taking place in developing countries of Africa, Latin America, and other countries in Asia. So whatever development were taking place in developing societies, that was not taken into consideration while coming out with the thesis of end of ideology and end of history. Right. So both end of ideology thesis and end of history thesis, they completely ignored the Western countries. So they completely ignored, both theses completely ignored the developing societies and they were West-centric theses. Right. One more important point, both the thesis, end of ideology and end of history thesis, they completely ignored the ongoing conflict that is going on in the world. Conflict in the world in the name of religion, conflict in the world that is taking place in the name of ethnicity, the conflict in because of environmental conflict, cultural conflict, religious conflict, linguistic conflict, ethnic conflict that is already taking place in the world that has not been taken care of. So you have said that this model is the best model, ignoring the other conflicts that is already taking place in the world. All right. So that is the criticism of uh, uh, that is the criticism of also of the end of ideology, end of history. All right. So I have explained the difference between the two, and I also explained similarity between end of ideology and end of history. Any question if you have in mind, you can ask me. While we'll start a new topic, and the new topic that we're going to start is liberalism. Now we are, if we have the syllabus in front of you, we are starting with political ideologies. And since we have discussed ideology already, so it will be easier for you to understand all these areas. So we'll start with liberalism, and then after completing liberalism, we'll take up Marxism, and then fascism, feminism, and Gandhism. All these ideologies will take one by one. Correct. And just I want to repeat that this week onwards, we'll have a class all 5 days a week. So tomorrow also you have a class. All right. We have talked enough about liberalism, liberal ideology. So you will have a fair idea, what liberalism is all about. Since we have talked about rights, since we have talked about justice, since we have talked about democracy. So all these things clubbing together, having been clubbed together, will lead into liberalism. So if we talk about democracy, if we talk about rights, if we talk about justice, this means we have a background of liberalism. You have a background of liberalism now. Let us take this. Let us start this topic, liberalism. So far as question on this topic is concerned, our focus will be on the difference between what is the classical liberalism and what is the modern liberalism. But more focus will be on the neoliberalism. You try to understand, because questions they would be asking would be on neoliberalism or maybe on libertarianism. So our focus would be the current situation of liberalism, the current phase of liberalism, current phase of liberal democracy that is going on in the world. It is a phase of neoliberalism. All right. So our focus will be more on neoliberalism. All right. Because in all likelihood, you would be asked a question on neoliberalism, even though we'll also be talking about broadly about the classical liberalism, the modern liberalism, and then it's to the neoliberalism. All right. What is liberalism? Of course, it is an ideology. An ideology that puts its focus on liberty of the individual. Means the primary focus of the ideology of liberalism is on the liberty of the individual. So liberty is the primary focus and foremost goal. So when we talk about liberty, also we have in mind rights. Don't think that liberty without rights is meaningless. So the primary focus of the ideology of liberalism would always be there on the rights and liberty of the people, and they have to give its focus. So this ideology is individual centric. Right. This ideology is individual centric, and they are putting the focus on liberty and rights of the individual. Right. Now, in what sense liberty? If we talk about the classical model of liberalism, and we had discussed liberty also, that it completely believed in. So the era of negative liberalism or era of negative liberty, in which the theory was that there should be complete absence of restraint by the authority of the state on the individual life. So individuals should be left completely free. Means no interference by the state. So initially, liberalism used to believe in negative liberty, in the complete absence of restriction on the individual. Right. See how this ideology of liberalism evolved. Of course, it evolved in the West in the late 17th century. And why it evolved? It primarily evolved to bring an end to the feudal privileges of the land-owning class. Land-owning class in the Western world, all right? The society was divided into feudal lords and serfs. And feudal lords, they were enjoying extraordinary privileges, all right? And the serfs, the people, the serfs class, there is a widening gap between between the feudal lords and the serfs, and the condition of the serfs in that feudal society was very, very, very bad. They did not have even the 2 squares mill. All right. So, in order to eliminate the feudal privileges of land-owning class, and this ideology of liberalism came into the existence. All right. Another important point was the second focus. So the first focus of liberalism initially was to bring an end to the privileges, extraordinary privileges that was being enjoyed by the feudal landowning class. And second focus was to create a very favorable condition for business and industry to grow. And that is why you find liberal capitalism, the more emphasis is on business and industry. So it evolved with the 2 objects in mind. One, to eliminate the feudal privileges of the landowning class, and secondly, creating a very conducive atmosphere for the development of industries, for the development of business. And that is why you have seen from feudal society, society was transferred to the capitalist society, and the capitalist society saw the growth of business and industry. Okay. So that the object was, if the business and industries they grow, so that would lead to the social progress. So that is how it evolved. So if we look into the journey of liberalism, as I have told you, that it started with a very progressive kind of ideology. It started as a way of life. It started as a demand for giving liberty and rights to the individual. It started as a measure, as a philosophy to protect the individuals from the authoritarian rulers. But what happened once the capitalist class were able to establish themselves in power, which was the goal? All right. The revolutionary fervor that was there in ideology of liberalism. What revolutionary fervor? Revolutionary fervor was a focus on the individual rights and liberty. So that fervor had gone. Once the capitalist class, they established themselves into the power. All right. And since the capitalist class came into the power, this liberal capitalist economy, this liberal capitalist model, or this model of liberalism, became the strongest defender of the capitalism. Right. So what happened is that the focus that was there on the individual, all right, because liberalism emerged as a very progressive ideology, but after capitalism established itself, all right, so from a progressive ideology, it got converted into an economic doctrine. This is what you need to understand. So liberalism, which started as a very progressive philosophy, having a focus on individuals' right and freedom, all right, ultimately, after the establishment of capitalism, became a defender of the status quo, because it started serving the interest of the capitalist class. All right. So from a progressive ideology, it became converted, it got itself converted into an economic doctrine. And that economic doctrine is the philosophy of economic doctrine or economic philosophy of capitalism. All right. It came to be dominated by the idea of utilitarians. Now, what was the utilitarian idea that we have seen? So we'll be going into different phases, but just now I'm giving a background how it evolved. All right. So liberalism got substituted by the ideology, the idea of utilitarianism, because utilitarianism became the justification for exploitation of the workers. And what is utilitarian philosophy? It talked about causing happiness, causing pleasure to the maximum number of people. If the maximum number of people is 51, it is correct. If the maximum number of people is 50, it is correct. So basically, it became a defender of the status quo. And it failed to take into cognizance this focus on utilitarianism, failed to take into cognizance the rights of a larger section of the society, and particularly the minorities. Means, as I have said earlier, it is because of liberalism, it is because of capitalism that the leftist movements grew in the world. If Marx emerged on the scene, if theory of communism emerged on the scene, it was primarily because of the exploitative character of liberal capitalism. Right? But of course, as we have seen, despite the opposition to the ideology of liberalism, liberalism has been the longest serving ideology in the world. Why it has become the longest serving ideology? It has become a longest serving ideology because it is flexible in nature. It has adopted certain measures even for the downtrodden class, talking about the welfare state scheme, talking about the affirmative action, talking about the reservation system. So it has been flexible in its character. So because of that flexibility in its character, that it is the longest serving ideology in the world. All right. If we talk about whose interest, every ideology, as we were discussing yesterday, that every ideology serves the interest of a particular class. So whose interest liberal ideology, this ideology of liberalism serves, like every other ideology, which serves the interest of a particular class, liberalism serves the interest of the capitalist class, as it is very obvious. Right? If communism serves the interest of the working class, so liberalism serves the interest of the capitalist class. Right? Let us try to understand, after I've given you a background about how this ideology of liberalism evolved. Let us try to understand. What is the focus of ideology of liberalism? The focus of ideology of liberalism, as I have said earlier, we are talking about liberty. And so humanism is the idea. But humanism, the focus of liberalism is on humanism. When I'm talking about humanism, do not confuse humanism with humanitarianism. There is a difference between humanism and humanitarianism. Okay? We are talking about humanism means as a human being. We are not talking of humanitarianism. The focus of ideology of if ideology of liberal capitalism becomes humanitarian, then what else do you want? This is the best ideology. If ideology of liberal capitalism or liberalism becomes humanitarian in its character, so there would be no better ideology than this. So do not confuse I've used the word humanism, but do not confuse humanism with humanitarianism. Humanism means it is a philosophy, liberalism is a philosophy, which takes human beings, which keeps human beings at its center. when he's talking about the negative liberty, when it talks about the non-interference in the life of the individual, okay? When it talks about the police state, when it talks about the minimal government. So the focus is on the individual. Focus is on the human beings. So since the focus of ideology of liberalism is on the human being, so we can say that this is an ideology which talks about, which believes in humanism. All right. In medieval times, the focus of ideology was on God, but in modern times, the focus of ideology is on the human beings. So human beings or the man is the focus of liberal ideology of liberalism. So since the focus is on the human being, so we say that humanism is the primary focus of the ideology of liberalism. So if we are asked to find out connectivity between liberalism and humanism, it is the connectivity. All right. Since it gives focus on human beings, it is said that liberalism, the ideology of liberalism, believes in a concept of automistic man. Automistic man means what? Considering human beings as an autonomous. Considering human being, it talks about autonomy of human beings. So this is called, when the liberalism believes in automistic man. Automistic man believes in, means that it believes in autonomy of the individual. It is individual centric, right? But this focus on automistic man has always been subjected to criticism. Why? Because if you talk about the human being's autonomy, or if you talk about individual's autonomy, it looks like that you consider a human being to be self-sufficient. It is not correct, right? Because human beings cannot live life on its own. Human beings, they need a society. Man is a social animal, and he who is unable to live in society is either a beast or God. You try to understand that, what Aristotle had said. Though human beings, man is a social animal, right? And he who is unable to live in society is either a beast or God. So this focus of liberalism on automistic man, automistic individual, is not correct, because it looks like that it considers individual as self-sufficient. No, man is a social animal, and man cannot live without society. Man cannot survive in the absence of the community. So even when we are talking about rights of a man, or even when we talk about the freedom of a man, we are talking about rights and freedom of the man as a member of the community, as a member of the society. Right. So the focus on the automistic man, as has been given by the ideology of liberalism, that may not be correct. But so two more elements we'll be talking about of this ideology of liberalism was on humanism. And what is humanism? I have already explained. And second is concept of automistic man. Right. Now, moving further from here, let us try to find out what are the main tenets or main crux of this ideology of liberalism before we take the classical model and the other model. All right. Main tenets of liberalism, ideology of liberalism, that it considers man to be a rational creature who knows what is good for him, what is bad for him, what is correct and what is incorrect. He says that man is rational. The ideology of liberalism considers man to be a rational creature, and he is a rational person. And since he is rational, he is capable of contributing towards the social progress. Apart from taking care of his own good, he can also contribute towards the social progress. He can take care of his own needs, and he can also contribute toward the social needs. All right. Now, according to ideology of liberalism, there is no basic contradiction between individual interest and common interest of the society. Because what is, if something is not in the interest of the individual, that cannot be in the interest of the society. That is a philosophy. So there is, according to the ideology of liberalism, there is no basic contradiction between individual interest and the common interest of the society. All right. In fact, the common interest of the society signifies a reconciliation of the common interest of society signifies the reconciliation of the interest of the different individuals. The interest of the different individuals coming together constitutes the common interest of the society. So according to this philosophy, there is no contradiction between individual interest and interest of the society. Another important point. According to this ideology of liberalism, man has taken birth, man has come to this planet, all right. Man has been endowed with certain natural rights, which even before society and state came into being, the point we have discussed earlier many a times, that even before the society and state came to being, man was enjoying certain rights. Those were the natural rights, and those natural rights man should continue to enjoy even after the formation of the state. Hence, the focus of the state should be on providing natural rights which people have been enjoying since time immemorial. For example, right to life, liberty, and property, and men should continue to enjoy that. And the focus of the state should be in securing those rights and protecting those rights to the people. Hence, in nut and shell, ideology of liberalism believes in the concept of natural rights, and people must enjoy those rights. Okay. Now, another important point, since the focus of liberalism, ideology of liberalism, is on individual, so liberalism is an individual-centric ideology, right? But what about the state? What about the state? What is the liberal take on the state? According to this ideology, the state or civil society that we are talking about, it's nothing but an artificial creation. Artificial creation means it has been created by men. Now try to understand the point. According to ideology of liberalism, a state or civil society is an artificial institution. Artificial institution. Why? Because it has come into being with the man's consent, with the people's consent. So people coming together, people coming together due to certain regions or certain difficulties in the state of nature, they decided to create a civil society, which ultimately created a state. So we are talking about, I'm giving reference to the social contract theory. What is social contract theory? According to social contract theory, state is an artificial creation, means it has been created by the man. People have come together and have created a state for their own benefit. All right. So state is an artificial creation, and it has been created to serve the common interest of man. It has been created to serve the common interest of man, and they can command. Who? State can command obedience from the individuals. The state can command obedience from the people only on the condition of fulfillment of a function. Which function? That they would be securing, preserving, and protecting the rights of the individual. The state has been created. It is an artificial creation. It has been created. The ideology of liberalism believes that the state has been created by man to serve the common interest of man. And what is the common interest? The common interest is to secure rights to the people, to preserve the rights of the people, and to protect the rights of the people. And if they do not perform this function, then the state has got no right with this. All right. This means ideology of liberalism believes that the state is an artificial institution created for the purpose of serving the common interest of man. All right. Going further from here, ideology of liberalism gives more focus on procedure rather than the product. The focus of ideology of liberalism is more on procedure rather than on the outcome. Hence, it gives more, if we talk about justice, it believes in procedural justice, but not in substantive justice. You have to understand this point. So the focus of the ideology of liberalism is more on procedure than on product. Number one. Another important point, this means the procedure for arriving at a decision. If the procedure for arrive at a decision is correct, then the decision might be accepted as a right. What liberalism says, if the procedure of arriving at a decision is correct, okay, the decision can be accepted as a right. To give you an example, if you are holding election after every 4 years in United States of America, if you are holding election after every 5 years in Britain, or if you are holding election after every 5 years in India, and people are voting for one particular party, all right, this is sufficient for liberalism to call it a liberal democracy, to call it the success of liberal democracy. So the emphasis is not on the outcome, not on the product, right? So even if liberal democracy turns into liberal autocracy, all right, so we'll not question that. We will not question that because the procedure is correct. So the focus of liberalism is more on procedure than on product. All right. Now, another important point, the point which I have referred earlier, that liberals give preference for liberty, equality, justice, and democracy. Okay? So the focus that liberalism gives on liberty, equality, and justice and democracy is nothing but the search for right procedure in different spheres of life. Yes. When liberalism says that liberty should be given to people, rights should be given to the people, right? Democracy should be established in society. So by giving focus on justice, liberty, democracy, and rights, you think that your job is done. Correct. Hence, when you see your constitution has given you certain fundamental rights, right? You have that. And there is a procedure also how it can be secured. Supreme Court is there, Article 32, right to proceedings on it. So you have a rights given to you by the Constitution. You have also a mechanism for protection of the rights, right? And for everything, procedure is there. Now, this is sufficient for liberalism. So that is why I said, so see, this means if you have a rights given to you by the Constitution, and even after that, if you starve, even after that, you are starving, you don't have the 2 squares meal, we are not going to question that. That is why I said the focus of liberalism on democracy, on election, on justice, on liberty, on rights is nothing but creating a procedure for different aspects of life. Nothing more than that. All right. Another important point. Any restriction on individual freedom, first of all, it says that no restriction should be there only. But if at all any restriction is to be imposed on the individual freedom, according to ideology of liberalism, it should be only for the purpose of ensuring the freedom of others. Otherwise, no. If the state is thinking in terms of putting up some restriction on the individual freedom, that should be there only to protect the freedom of somebody else. Means if my freedom becomes an obstruction for enjoyment of freedom by others, at that point of time, state can restrain my freedom. So that is what it said in the liberalism, that restriction on individual freedom should be there only in case of safeguarding somebody's freedom. Right. Another important point in the ideology of liberalism. Ideology of liberalism believes in upholding a freedom of contract. What is the meaning of freedom? Ideology of liberalism is very closely related with the freedom of contract. You have yourself seen the state itself is an outcome of the contract according to some of the liberals. What is the meaning of ideology of liberalism upholds the freedom of the contract? Means freedom of the contract means no individual can be forced, no individual can be coerced to accept any obligation without his consent. You try to understand my point. If you have come on this platform, you have come on this platform, you are attending this online class with your own consent. Nobody has forced you to do that. There is a contract between you and me, or there is a contract between your institute and you. What is the contract? That you are going to be taught this PSIR as a subject. All right. So there is a contract, and the syllabus, that is a contract between you and the institute. But this is what is the logic in liberalism, that upholding of the contract, but nobody would be forced to enter into a contract. Nobody would be forced to oblige. Nobody would be forced to enter into a contract without his mutual consent and without the mutual benefit. So in contract between the two parties, say when you are going and buying a platform ticket, there is a contract between you and the railways that you would be allowed to stand in the platform for a certain number of hours. That is a contract between you and the railways. Again, when you have booked a ticket, there is a contract between you and the railways, or you and the airways. There is a contract. If you bought a ticket, that they would facilitate your travel from one place to another. So, according to ideology of liberalism believes in upholding the freedom of the contract, but nobody would be forced to enter into a contract. If you are going to buy a house, you are buying it out of your own choice. Nobody should be forcing you to do that. All right. And state would be only acting as an umpire for enforcement of the contract. Means, if you have entered into a contract with the railways for making a travel, or in airways for making a travel from Hyderabad to Chennai, if you have entered into a contract, and if the flight is not running, all right, and you are being not refunded the money, all right, then ultimately the state would be coming into the picture, all right, and you can challenge it. You can go to the consumer court, all right. So the state would be functioning as an umpire for enforcement of the contract. So any contract that is entered into, okay, with any kind of pressure would be void. If you are forced to enter into a contract, that contract would be void. That contract would be illegal. So, yet another tenet of the ideology of liberalism is that it believes in upholding the freedom of the contract. All right. One more important point. The public policy that the state comes out with should be based on the common interest of all. All right. And it should not be based on the specific interest of a specific group or individual. The policy which state is coming out with, all right, the policy which the state is coming out with, that should be reflecting the common interest of all individuals. And it should not be like that the state is coming out with a policy only to serve the interest of a particular class. That is not the ideology of liberalism. All right. So what we have seen, if we try to recapitulate so far what we have studied in liberalism, in nut and shell, this model of liberalism involves the creation of a market model of society. When you talk about non-interference of the state, when you're talking about giving freedom to the individual, all right, when you're talking about the freedom of contract. So all these things indicate that this model of liberal capitalism or model of liberalism involves a creation of a market model of society where the role of the state should be confined to protection of the individual rights, individual rights, individual freedom, individual property, and enforcement of the contract. So you are talking in terms of the ideology of liberalism, talking in terms of giving a minimum responsibility to the state. It talks in terms of minimal state. So this liberalism, ideology liberalism is nothing but it signifies a creation of a market model of society where the role of the state is confined to protection of the individual rights, right to life, liberty, and property, and enforcement of the contract. All right. Now, so the primary focus of, or the central focus of the ideology of liberalism is a relationship between individual and the state. When you're talking about the rights, when you're talking about the freedom, when you're talking about the freedom of the contract. So the primary focus of, because the state is considered to be an encroacher, the state is considered to be a limit, state is considered to be an encroacher of the rights and freedom of the people. Right? So the primary focus of the ideology of liberalism is on the relationship between individual and the state. Right? And what would be the role of the state would be determined by whether you are talking about, whether we are talking about negative liberalism or whether we are talking about the positive liberalism. So liberalism can be divided into negative liberalism, the classical model of liberalism, and the positive liberalism means the modern liberalism. Try to understand the point. So when I'm saying the primary focus of liberalism in our relationship between individual and the state, and how it would be determined, it would be determined by whether you believe in whether you are talking about the negative liberalism or you are talking about positive liberalism. If you are talking about the negative liberalism, in which the state is considered to be antithetical to the human beings, antithetical to the human beings in the sense that it is antithetical to the liberty and rights of the individual, and you believe in complete non-interference by the state in the individual life. So in that sense, we are talking about a negative relationship between the state and the individual. But when you talk about the positive liberalism, that is the modern era of liberalism, means the state was also considered to be a facilitator. The state was also considered to be a welfare state. When the state got the welfare state, means it was the responsibility of the state to bring about socio-economic justice. All right. In negative liberalism, you believe in a freedom of contract. Whatever is the outcome, you are not bothered. All right. But in positive liberalism or in modern liberalism, when you try to understand the relationship between individual and the state, the relationship is positive, means the state can interfere. The state can interfere to bring about socio-economic justice in society. To give you an example, right to property, which was a fundamental right in the Indian Constitution, and because of fundamental right, many socio-economic developmental activities, what government tried to carry out. Government wanted to nationalize some industries, they were not able to do that because of right to property was there. All right. Government wanted to carry out land reforms, it was very difficult to carry out land reforms, why right to property was there. So amendment was brought about. All right. Amendment was brought about and right to property was converted into a legal right. It is no more a fundamental right. All right. So what I'm trying to tell you is this is an example of the positive liberalism. All right. Or when the state came out with the policy of reservation, bringing about giving its preferential treatment to the people belonging to SC, ST or the OBC. So in that case, it is a role of a positive state. So when you talk about the relationship between individual and the state, as per the ideology of liberalism, it would be depending upon whether we are talking about the negative liberalism or whether we are talking about the positive liberalism. All right. When you talk about the different phases of liberalism, all right, so three phases we'll be talking about: classical phase, modern phase, and now the neoliberal phase. All right. More focus will be on neoliberalism. All right. Classical liberalism, I'll not be going into details. You are aware of this. Classical liberalism means liberty in all spheres of life. Why? Because individual is considered to be a best judge of his own interest. What is in the interest of the individual? Who is the state to decide about that? this would be decided by the individual. I'm talking about now the classical model of liberalism, and we'll see it with reference to views of some of the political philosophers. So first I'll give you what is the main tenet of the classical model of liberalism. They want liberty in all spheres. Number two, every individual is the best judge what is in his own interest. All right. And state cannot impose its own conception. State cannot impose its own concept of good or bad on the individual. All right. It believed in the concept of a minimal state. The term minimal state means the state would be acting only as a night watchman or as a referee or as an umpire. So only when the players are playing the fall that the state would be coming to the picture. So long as the players are playing the game according to the rules of the game, the state will not come into the picture. Right? So this concept of a minimal state, which was given by Henry Sidgwick. So if you use the term minimal state, all right, you should use the term minimal state has been given by Henry Sidgwick, 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 Henry Sidgwick, minimal state term. So it believes in the concept of classical model of liberalism, believed in the concept of minimal state, right? Or it believed in the idea of survival for the fittest, given by Herbert Spencer, Herbert Spencer, Herbert Spencer, Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer gave the concept of survival for the fittest. So it believes survival for the fittest means, see, the state would not help you. If you are capable of surviving, you survive. Otherwise, you perish. Those who are capable of surviving, they would survive. Otherwise, they would perish. The state is not bothered about that. All right. So, classical model of liberalism believed in a minimal state, and it believed in the ideology of survival for the fittest as given by Herbert Spencer. Right. Now, the most influential idea of classical liberalism was given by John Locke. Okay. John Locke was the one who gave a very influential idea about the classical. So we are talking about those political philosophers who talked about the classical model of liberalism. Locke is the first one. Okay. And according to Locke, right to life, liberty, and property, these are the natural rights which people have been enjoying in the state of nature, and they must be protected by the state. Right. And according to Locke, justification of the state's authority, whether state should remain there or not, or whether people should be obeying the commands of the state or not, that would be dependent upon the state's capacity to protect the rights of man. If a state is able to protect the rights of man, they can ask for obedience from the individual. But if they are not in a position to provide that, they cannot ask for obedience from the individual. Okay, so justification of state's authority would be dependent upon the fact whether the state is able to provide, secure, and protect these three rights: right to life, liberty, and property to the people or not. If they are able to provide this, they can command obedience from the individuals, otherwise not. All right. One more important point when we are talking about law. If a state is not able to protect the rights of the people, or if a state is not able to secure these rights to the people, these three rights, right to life, liberty, and property, then according to law, people can rebel against the state. People can revolt against the state for its failure in providing or protecting the right to life, liberty, and property of the people. So Locke, the most important protagonist of the classical model of liberalism, clearly gives individual the right to rebel against the state if it fails to protect the rights of the individual. All right. Andrew Heywood, ANDREW HEYWOOD, Andrew Heywood. talking about classical model of liberalism, Andrew Hewitt says the emphasis of classical liberalism is on three things. I'm talking about, I have just now told you about Locke. Now I'm discussing what Hewitt says about classical model of liberalism. According to Andrew Hewitt, emphasis of classical model liberalism is on three things. Number one, human beings are essentially self-interested. Okay, they are more bothered about their own self-interest. Right, they can take care of their own interest. Right. So, point number one: what is the opinion of Andrew Hewitt about the classical liberalism? Number one, human beings are essentially self-interested. Okay. Number two, they are largely self-sufficient. Henry says they are self-interested and they are self-sufficient. Largely self-sufficient means they do not need a state, they do not need anybody, they can take care of their own interests. So they are largely self-sufficient. Okay. And number three, according to Henry Hewitt, who is explaining this classical model of liberalism, Henry Hewitt says that as far as possible, people should be responsible for their own lives and circumstances. Okay, the state should not be coming into the picture. The people should not be dependent on the state. What he's saying is that as far as possible, states should be responsible for their own lives and circumstances. All right. So this is what Andrew Hewitt says about the classical model of liberalism. Okay. Let us try to understand. This classical model of liberalism, as we have seen, had some negative consequences. Let us try to understand what were the negative consequences of classical model of liberalism that gave birth to the positive model of liberalism. Number one, uncontrolled growth of capitalism. This classical model of liberalism, because it did not believe in any kind of state interference, and it gave so much of freedom, economic freedom to the individual. So this gave birth to an extraordinary rise of capitalism. Inordinate growth, extraordinary growth, uncontrolled growth of capitalism. Number one. Number two, profit became the central motive. Profit became the central focus of this ideology of liberalism, and profit got concentrated into the small number of capitalists and industries. I'm talking about the negative consequence of liberalism because it did not allow state to interfere. Okay. So one was the uncontrolled growth of capitalism. Second was that the profit became the central focus of the ideology of liberalism, and profit got concentrated into the small number of capitalists and the industrialist class. All right. What happened as a result of this? Masses, general masses, they failed in deriving benefit out of, this extraordinary growth of capitalism. The growth was there. Expansion of capitalism was there. Uncontrolled expansion of capitalism was there. Industrialization was there. But masses, they failed to derive any benefit out of this. All right. So out of the flow of wealth that came out of the factories, the large-scale production that came out of the factories, in which workers had also contributed, but workers they were not able to derive any benefit out of the growth of the capital, out of the growth of the profit of the capitalist class. Workers, they did not derive any benefit out of the growth of capitalism. So capitalism grew, industry grew, the development took place, but the masses, the workers, they were not able to derive any benefit of capitalism. As a result of this, there is a growing poverty of the masses. All right, it led to the growing poverty of the masses. Right. So industrial revolution led to mass production of goods and services. Obviously, I've told you it was an uncontrolled growth of capitalism. This negative liberalism, model of liberalism, the classical model of liberalism, led to extraordinary growth of capitalism and industrialist class. So industrial revolution was there, but it led to mass production of goods and services, but masses could not afford to buy. They did not have money. So this is the contradiction of the classical model of liberalism, is that the huge wealth that was flowing out of the factory, all right, the mass production that came out of the factory, the mass production of goods and services, that was the consequence of this model of classical model of liberalism. There, it was there. But masses, they could not afford to buy. There was a mass production of goods, there is a mass production of services, but masses could not afford to buy the product or the service. So this is the negative consequence of the classical model of liberalism. Ultimately, what happened? Markets become glutted. Glutted in the sense that there's no demand. There was a product from the factory. So market got filled up with goods. Market got glutted. Why? Because the masses, they did not have the purchasing power. Wealth got concentrated in the hands of the capitalist and industrialist class. All right. So the system, this liberal capitalist system, almost came near a halt. All right, leading to great economic depression that we have seen in 1929 and 1930. The great economic depression that came into being was a consequence of the classic model of liberalism, where the production was there, production of goods and services was there, but buyers were not there because the masses, they did not have the purchasing power. So system came to almost near a halt, and the entire world went into the phase of economic depression. You have already seen that. All right. Now, industrial class use their power not only in the economic decision making, but they also, since they had economic power, so they use the power not only in the economic decision making, but they also influence the government. Right? So because of this, government failed to take any initiative. And they force them, right? They force them not to come out with social reform. So government, because of the influence of capitalists and industrial class on the government failed to come out with any social reform. So this is the negative consequence of the classical model of liberalism, which gave birth to modern liberalism. Now we'll start discussing the modern liberalism. What is modern model of liberalism? Modern liberalism. We are now moving from classical liberalism to modern liberalism. So what was the consequence? Uprising of the working class, agitation by the working class. Classical liberalism was subject to severe criticism, all right? And these circumstances led to the birth of modern model of liberalism or the modern liberalism. Now, the first exponent of the modern liberalism, which I'll refer to, will be T.H. Green. T.H. Green, G-R-E-E-N, T.H. Green. T.H. Green says, the wealth was coming out of the factory, wealth was flowing out of the factory, but the wealth could not solve the issue of poverty, discrimination, ignorance, problem of disease, bad health. these problems that society was facing, what T.S. Green says, the entire Western world was facing the problem of poverty, disease, discrimination, ignorance, illiteracy. Now, these problems could be overcome, could be resolved only with the positive liberty or only with the interference of the government or only with the government taking the welfare measures. So the problems which the entire liberal capitalist world was facing, according to T.S. Green, could be resolved only with the positive interference of the state, only with the assistance of the government. So now what was required was an state interference, and what was required was the welfare measures to be taken by the state, which earlier was not possible in the classical model. After that, another scholar, another political scientist, another political theorist, whose name I would refer now, was J.S. Mill. J.S. Mill was the another political philosopher. So J.S. Mill came into the picture when Europe was undergoing a transition from negative liberalism to positive liberalism. I have already told you about what T.S. Green had said, that in order to resolve the issues of poverty, discrimination, ignorance, disease, state must come into the picture and state must play a positive role. Now, J.S. Mill came into the scene, came into the picture when the state was in a phase of transition from negative liberalism to positive liberalism, as we were saying. All right. So initially, when Mill had started, he had started with the laissez-faire model of individual liberalism. Laissez-faire model of liberalism is again a negative model of liberalism, but looking into the weakness of, initially when J.S. Mill started, he had favored a negative model of liberalism. But when we looked into the consequence of the negative model of liberalism, while realizing the weaknesses of the negative model of liberalism, all right, and while looking into the socio-economic inequality that grew in society, he modified his ideas of negative model of liberalism, and he now suggested ways for the state to interfere. And J.S. Mill talks about two activities. It talks about the two activities. It talks about that he says that there are two kinds of activities of a man. One is self-regarding activity of man, and another is the other regarding activity of a man. Hence, if I'm getting married, according to J.S. Mill, this is self-regarding action. But when I'm moving on a road, and when I'm driving a vehicle on the road, so my action is also concerning the action of others. My action is concerning others. So what J.S. Mill says, that so far as self-regarding action of the individual is concerned, the state should not interfere. But whenever individual acts and his action concerns the freedom and rights of the other. So this means in other regarding, he divided the action of the individual into two compartments, one self-regarding and other regarding. And according to J.S. Mill, the state should not interfere in the self-regarding action of man. In the other regarding action of man, the state can interfere. All right. When action of the individual impacts others, the state can come into the picture. All right. Means the state can bring about a law to regulate the individual behavior if it is related to the interest of others in the society. So regarding action, so you remember that J.S. Mill initially favored the negative model of liberalism, but looking into the bad consequence of negative model of liberalism, he find a via media. He adopted a via media, and he said that let us divide the action of the individuals into self-regarding and other regarding, and in other regarding action, a state can interfere. All right. So J.S. Mill contemplated a positive role for the state in securing the social welfare, and he went to the extent of saying, if in securing welfare, or while securing the social welfare, even if you have to curb individual freedom of some people, it can be done to some extent. J.S. Mill went to the first. He said, in other regarding, state can interfere. Then he said, the state will also be responsible for bringing about the social welfare. And while doing the social welfare, if the state is required to curb the liberty of the individual, liberty of some individual, state can do that, but to a limited extent. This is what J.S. Mill says. Right. Another political theorists who talk about the positive model of liberalism, they were Hobhouse, Hobhouse, Hobhouse and Lasky. Hobhouse and Lasky. Okay. Hobhouse and Lasky said that right to property, because right to property leads to concentration of wealth. So Hobhouse and Lasky were of the opinion, and they advocated, they said that right to property was not an absolute right, and the state must secure the welfare of the people. And while securing the welfare of the people, even if they have to curtail the economic liberty of the privileged class, they can do that. What Hobhouse and Lasky said, they said that right to property, first of all, is not an absolute right? Because it leads to concentration of wealth. And they said that the state must secure the welfare of the people, and while securing the welfare of the people, even if they have to curtail the economic liberty of the privileged class, they can do that. They should do that. That is what is the view of Hobhouse and H.J. Lasky, or Professor Harold J. Lasky. Hobhouse, Hobhouse, and Lasky. That is the opinion. Okay. So according to Hobhouse and Lasky, the process of modern liberalism, basically they say that the modern liberalism, not the classical liberalism, they say that modern liberalism could also be explained as welfarism, because the purpose is the welfare of the people. The purpose of modern liberalism is welfare of the people. So modern liberalism could also be explained as an ideology of welfarism. Right. So this means now we have moved from a classical model of liberalism to a modern model of liberalism, which is also a modern of welfarism or a modern of a welfare state. Means now it is in the modern model of liberalism, as we have seen, that it is the responsibility of the state to take care of the welfare of the people. This state was given a right to interfere in the life of the people to bring about socio-economic justice. Right. Let us look into, before we switch over to the most crucial aspect of our discussion, the neoliberalism. Let us look into the criticism of this ideology of liberalism. Okay. Let us look into the criticism of the ideology of liberalism from communitarian perspective, from the point of view of communitarian philosophy. Communitarian philosophy or communitarianism means which believes in interest of the community. Liberalism, particularly negative liberalism, believes in primacy of the individual, whereas communitarianism believes in the primacy of community. Okay, so they give more preference to individual as a member of the community. So let us look into the criticism of ideology of liberalism from communitarian perspective. You could be asked a question, what is the communitarian critique of liberalism? Or earlier we have seen, when we are discussing Rawls' theory of justice, and we had also looked into the communitarian critique of Rawls' theory of justice. Let us let's look into the communitarian. What is communitarian philosophy, first of all? Communitarian philosophy is based on the philosophy of brotherhood and fraternity. Communitarian philosophy believes in philosophy of brotherhood and philosophy of fraternity, and it is based on the idea that each individual is very closely connected with the society at large. Means individual is closely connected and integrated. It is closely connected and integrated with the larger part of the community. Means individual as an individual will have no significance. Individual will have a significance only as a member of the community. That's what you need to understand. All right. Individual will have a significance according to communitarian philosophy. Individual will have a significance only as a member of the community. All right. So this ideology of liberalism talked about individual rights, talked about individual freedom, but they did not attach any significance to the individual as a member of the society. They did not look into the connectivity. They did not look into the integrational aspect of individual with the community. So that is why communitarians have criticized the atomistic concept of man. See, initially when I was explaining the tenets of liberalism, I had said it believes in atomistic man. It believes in autonomy of man. So the idea of autonomy of man or idea of atomistic individual of liberalism goes against the idea of communitarianism. So that is the criticism. All right. Now, communitarians have criticized the ideology of liberalism by saying that individual is a responsible member of the community. Communitarians have criticized the ideology of liberalism because idealism gave focus on individualism, gave focus on, it is an individual-centric ideology, it gave focus on atomistic man. So the communitarians say that ideology of liberalism, particularly the classical liberalism, they did not look into the fact that individual is a responsible member of the community, and individual has got a responsibility towards the society because society has given him everything. So if you take so much thing from the community, if you take so much from the society, then you also have to give it to society, right? And by doing so, by giving primacy to the individual, by giving primacy to the individual interest over the common interest of the society, liberalism has done wrong. Liberalism has committed an error. The philosophy of liberalism has committed an error because they have given more primacy to the individual interest rather than to the interest of the community. All right. Communitarian critics say that this model of liberalism is going to create a fragmented society. See, right now, what we have seen, we have a liberal capitalist economic model. People are self-centered. People are more materialistic in nature, in character. If you're crossing the road, out of 10 people who see somebody dying, maybe just one of them will stop there. 9 people, they will not bother to look into that. They will just turn their eyes. So what communitarian critics say, that this ideology of liberalism has created a fragmented society. All right? It promotes an isolated individual. Ideology of liberalism, while criticizing this ideology of liberalism, communitarian critics said that it has created a fragmented society. It has isolated individual from the society, and it has disconnected individual from society. So what ideology of liberalism has created? The ideology of liberalism has created an isolated and disconnected individual. That is the criticism of liberalism from the communitarian perspective. All right. Means the critics, the communitarian critics, while talking about the liberalism, say that while disregarding the role of the community, see, you are giving more focus on individual, and you are not bothered about, you're not talking about the community. So they say that by disregarding the role played by the community, you are also disregarding the ways in which individual develops himself as a member of the community. What the community critics are saying, they are saying that by disregarding the role that the community plays in the life of the individual, you are also disregarding that individual develops himself as a member of the community. You are completely disregarding this fact. Right? This means people would continue to enjoy the benefits of the society without bothering about the society. People would continue to enjoy the benefits given to it by the community. All right. But they would not bother about the community. Try to understand the point. So this is the contradiction. According to communitarian theory, people would continue to enjoy the benefits given by the society. All right. Because this ideology of liberalism has made people so much self-centered that they would continue to enjoy the benefits given to them by the society, but without bothering about to take care of the interests of the society. So this is the biggest criticism against the ideology of liberalism as given by communitarians. Now, now we'll shift to neoliberalism. The birth of neoliberalism, or the beginning of neoliberalism, took shape from the idea of libertarianism. Try to understand the point. How this idea of neoliberalism evolved? First, you should understand that neoliberalism or libertarianism is nothing but it is a revival of classical model of liberalism. This is what you should understand. Broadly speaking, neoliberalism or libertarianism is nothing but a revival of classical model of liberalism. Okay. So right now, we are living in an era of neoliberalism wherein efforts have been made to revive the classical model of liberalism. How? This is what we are going to see. The most crucial aspect of our discussion in this topic. Okay. So let us look into what is the beginning of neoliberalism? The beginning of neoliberalism is in the form of libertarianism. Libertarianism is those philosophers who give emphasis on liberty, liberty, and liberty. And this is what we had seen in the classical model of liberalism. Emphasis on individual liberty. Okay. So some contemporary liberal thinkers, they are known as libertarians, and they sought to give emphasis on negative liberty again. So we moved from classical model of liberalism to positive model of liberalism, and again going back to the classical model of liberalism. Okay. So that is what is libertarianism. So some of the contemporary liberal thinkers, they are known as libertarians, and they have sought to put emphasis on negative liberty once again. Among such thinkers, we can take some names. Berlin, B-E-R-L-I-N. His name is Issa Berlin, but I'll take the short name Berlin, B-E-R-L-I-N. Or you can write the full name Issa Berlin, I-S-A-I-A-H. I-S-A-I-A-H, Issa Berlin, B-E-R-L. Hayek, H-A-Y-E-K, Hayek, F-A-Hayek, F, full stop, Hayek, Hayek, Friedman, Friedman, Milton Friedman we had discussed yesterday also. Milton Friedman, Friedman, Milton Friedman, and Robert Nozick, Robert Nozick. So Hayek and Nozick, Hayek, Hayek, and Robert Nozick, Nozick. These are the two important protagonists of the libertarianism, or the libertarian model of liberalism. So whether you will ask a question on libertarianism or libertarian model of liberalism, all right, or even when you will ask a question on neoliberalism, you have to start with libertarianism. And when you discuss libertarianism, you should focus on Robert Nozick and FAK. Now, let me first explain what is this libertarianism, which is the beginning of liberalism. All right. This revival of classical model of liberalism, or what is known as libertarianism, this started in 1990. This started in 1990s. Libertarianism started in 1990s. And according to, first I will explain what is the main philosophy of libertarianism. Upholding the liberty of people is the core principle of libertarianism, as the title itself explains. Libertarianism is more focused on liberty. So upholding the liberty is the core principle of libertarianism. So we can say that this is a new form of classical liberalism. All right. Focus of libertarianism is on maximizing individual authority, providing maximum freedom to the individual or maximizing individual authority, giving complete political freedom to man, giving emphasis on freedom of association, giving emphasis on freedom of choice. Is it not the influence of libertarianism that Supreme Court in India gave a decision justified live-in relationship? Is it not influence of libertarianism because it believes in freedom of choice? So giving focus on free association, freedom of choice, more focus on individualism, more focus on voluntary association, means, so this is basically nothing but a revival of, in one way or the other, it is a revival of the classical model of liberalism, right? But with some difference. So when we look into neoliberalism, because you cannot go back, say that state would not interfere absolutely in the economy. But yes, the way you are giving preference to privatization and privatization, government is developing an airport and giving back to the industrialists to run that. Is it not a model of neoliberalism? So we'll look into that. What is the view of libertarianism on individual? According to libertarians, individual is the end in itself. In welfare model, socio-economic justice is the goal. But here focus is again has gone back to the individual. Individual is the end. Correct. Autonomy of the individual is absolute. Means we can say that it is a very radical form of individualism. So talking about libertarians' view of individual, we can say that it is a very radical form of individualism. What is the view of the state? What is the libertarian view of the state? Believe in the limited government. Our Prime Minister also says quite often, minimum government, maximum governance. So far as libertarians' view on state is concerned, they believe in limited government. Why? Because the state is considered by libertarians to be the greatest enemy of the liberty of the individual. The state is considered to be greatest enemy to the liberty of the individual. So that is the view of the state, view on the state. And according to libertarians, the state should not at all be interfering with respect to the liberty of the individual. According to libertarians, the state should not be interfering into the individual liberty of the individual, in respect to the liberty of the individual. All right. Now, let's try to understand. So I have told you libertarians' view on individual. I have also tried to explain their view on state. Now let us understand libertarians' view on rights. What is that take on rights? Of course, libertarians believe in supremacy of rights. All right. Libertarians, they believe in supremacy of rights. See, there is some problem, the power has gone. It will come in a minute. All right. So what I was saying that it believes in supremacy of individual rights. It acknowledges negative rights, means individual is free to do almost anything which would not harm anyone. According to libertarians, individual is absolutely free to do anything provided it doesn't harm anyone. So talking about rights, the point I have said earlier, it believes in supremacy of individual rights, number one. Secondly, it believes in giving freedom to the individual to do almost anything if it doesn't harm anyone. Another important point about rights, it believes in discarding positive rights. The state cannot take away the rights of the individual for any social benefit. It doesn't believe, this means it doesn't believe in a welfare state. Libertarians said very clearly that the state cannot take away the rights of some people, even to provide benefit to the social benefit to the larger community. Means if it comes to taking the rights of, if it comes to taking the rights of some industrialist or some capitalist for providing benefit to the larger masses, you cannot do that. All right. So the state cannot take away the rights of the individual, even for providing social benefit. All right. So this is the take of libertarians on rights. So I've talked about libertarians' view on individual, their view on state, and their view on rights. And I've already told you that we need to discuss the two important viewpoints, Nozick and FAA, which will be going in due course of time. Right. So I've started with neoliberalism, and having seen its origin in libertarianism. Okay, now why neoliberalism? What is the issue? Why this birth of libertarianism? Why this birth of neoliberalism? Let us try to understand. After almost 3 decades of unprecedented growth after World War II, all right, which proved to be a success of modern liberalism. After almost more than 3 decades of unprecedented growth after the Second World War, which proved the success of modern liberalism, why all of a sudden we started talking in terms of revival of classical model of liberalism or libertarianism or neoliberalism? All right. But let us look into the reason. Mid-70s, we have seen, there was an economic slowdown and economic stagnation. Mid-70s, entire world over, there was economic slowdown and economic stagnation. Right? A serious challenge to modern liberalism cropped up. Why? Because despite state having started welfare measures, despite emergence of welfare state in the capitalist countries, in the developing countries, despite the emergence of welfare state, in our country, we started a policy of reservation initially for 10 years, not much difference, for another 10 years, for another 10 years. So what had happened is that there was a lot of pressure. So despite the beginning of the concept of welfare state, there is no end. There is no end to the welfare schemes or the investment that government was making on the welfare state. Now, try to understand the point. Affirmative action, the policy which was started by the state governments by the different states, which was thought to be a temporary measure, affirmative action or a policy of reservation, which was thought to be a temporary measure, was proving to be a permanent one. And different states, they had to go on spending and spending and spending money. So the fund was getting diverted from development to the social welfare measures. All right. So there is a compulsion for the governments to maintain social benefit, because social welfare measures once started, there is no end to it. All right. The goal of socio-economic justice, we thought we'll be able to complete it in the first 10 years. We are not able to do that. Next 10 years, we are not able to do that. So that thing continued. All right. So there is a compulsion for the government to maintain the social economic benefit, social benefit. So this social welfare measures push the government towards excessive taxation, because from where the money is going to come. So you are going to tax the rich. All right. When you are and you are going to tax the rich to provide benefit to the poor. All right. And even the taxation, even in India, what percentage of population in India is paying income tax? You are preparing for UPSC, you should be knowing that. Less than 3%. The people who pay income tax in India, it was just 3% people. So a huge economic burden that is there on the government to undertake social welfare measures, to continue the social welfare schemes. So government will have to go on increasing the taxes, increasing the tax bracket, somehow excessive taxation. So either the government would be going on the messy debts, they will be taking a loan. So how much loan we have taken from IMF and the World Bank, you know that. So every government would have to go on taking a loan from the world financial institutions,